Hey kids, Flexing Teacher Weber here. I hope everything is going well. I wanted to make a couple of videos of what we did in math for the last few days to help you with the homework that you have this weekend. The assignment ML 136 numbers 8, 9, and 10. The last couple of days we've been focusing on starting with a percent and making it a decimal and a fraction. Now the key thing to remember here is that when you're starting with a percent and making it a fraction, percent means out of 100. So you always make the denominator of that fraction out of 100. When you're starting with a percent, no matter what, denominator's out of 100. So we started off with a couple of grade 7 examples where you have numbers between 1% and 100%. So 45%, to make that a fraction, it's going to be out of 100. Oh, I got to change my ink here. Just give me a moment. Technical difficulties. Doink. There we go. So we got to make that out of 100. And then it's 45 out of 100. And then always with fractions, reducing to lowest terms. Every day in class I do facts with the kids. We've been practicing division facts. And this is where those come in handy, right? Using divisibility rules from grade 7. You divide the numerator and denominator by 5, and you get 9 over 20 for your fraction in lowest terms. So that's the basics. It's always out of 100 when converting a percent to a fraction. So we'll look at another one here. And these kinds of things, often kids get going quickly. They make mistakes. So this is 8 out of 100. Right? Percent means out of 100. So that's 8 out of 100. And then reducing to lowest terms. Hopefully you'll recognize that you can divide both numerator and denominator by 4. For kids who struggle with division, I always tell them to think reverse multiplication. So what do I multiply by 4 that gets me 8? What do I multiply by 4 that gets me 100? So if you have trouble with division, think multiplication. 4 times 2 is 8, and 4 times 25 is 100. And that's in lowest terms. So we started off taking percents and making them into fractions. Then we want to take that percent and make it a decimal. And the way I explain that is I tell them to write this as a decimal, look at the fraction out of 100. It will give you all of the clues. So 45 out of 100. The denominator out of some magnitude of 10 always tells us the number of decimal spots. 100, 2 zeros means 2 decimal spots. 1, 2. And in those decimal spots go 45 and a 0 in front. The reason I teach it like this is for when you get examples like 8 out of 100 or 8%. So for 8%, think 8 out of 100. Because a common mistake with this is that if kids don't think 8 out of 100, they say the decimal is 8/10. But what you have to remember is that there's 2 zeros on 100. So there's going to be 2 decimal spots. I'm running out of space here. Okay, so 2 decimal spots. I'll do my best here. And we need to have 8 in the 100th spot, so it's 8 and 0. And a 0 placeholder in the 1 spot. So using that fraction out of 100 will always tell you the number of decimal spots, and often we mix that up if we don't do that. Often the very common error here is to say, oh, I know what 8% is. That's 0.8. But that is not correct. Doink. Doink. We'll make that go away. So those are the grade 7 kind of examples, okay? Now in grade 8, this is what we're trying to do. I'm going to flip forward. In grade 8, we're going to look at fractions over 100%, and we're going to look at very tiny fractions, or percentages over 100%, and very tiny percentages. So let's start with a percent over 100%. Now, there's 2 ways I can think of this. 160% means, technical difficulties tonight, kids. It's been a long week. So 160% means out of 100. So you could do this. You could do 160 out of 100. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. That's a really good math. But I like to make it a little easier. I like to think of it like this. So 160% means 100% plus 60%. Okay? And if you're thinking, one of the very first things we did at the start of the year was we shaded in what percents look like. And if you're shading in 100% on a hundreds grid, that looks like one whole. So I like to think of this as one whole. Whenever you're dealing with a percent that's above 100%, when it's a fraction, it's going to be a mixed number. It's going to have a whole number part and a fraction part. So I'm going to scooch down here, and I'm going to say that instead of thinking of this as 160 out of 100, I'm going to think of it as one whole. The 100% represents one whole, and then the 60% represents the fractional part. And remember, percent means out of 100, so we're going to think of that as denominator 100 and 60 out of 100. And I prefer to think of that as 1 and 60 out of 100. Now we're going to put that in lowest terms right away, but whenever I have the fraction of a 10, 100, or 1,000, I immediately like to check and get the decimal. Now, the zeros tell us everything. The zeros on the denominator. If you have the fraction out of 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, the zeros tell us everything. They tell us the number of decimal spots. So 2 zeros on 100 means I'm going to have 2 decimal spots. And in those decimal spots, I will put the 6 and the 0. So 6, 0, and the whole number 1 is a whole number, so that goes in front. And of course, some math people get really picky and they say, well, isn't 1 and 60/100ths the same as just 1 and 6/10ths? And I would say, absolutely. That is the same thing. And either answer is correct. But often in math, we want to keep things as simple as possible. So usually that's how we'd want to write that. But either one is good. Fraction in lowest terms. Don't forget about that. 1 and 60 out of 100. Hopefully you'll recognize you can divide by 20, or you could divide by 10 and then divide by 2. There's a bunch of different ways to do it. So you still have one whole, and then 20 times 3 is 60, and 20 times 5 is 100. So we're going to have 1 and 3 over 5 as our fraction in lowest terms. That's more of a grade 8 kind of question because it's a larger percentage over 100%. What I'm going to do in the second video is I'm going to do the really, really small percentages that we did. And we'll take a look at that, and then hopefully that'll help you with your assignment this weekend. That's all for now. I'll make another video in a second. Flexing Teacher Weber out.